It has been 4 years. March 3rd, 2005, in this unlikely place. A brutal crime that has become engraved in the national memory for all time. 4 young mounted policemen shot down by a deranged loner on a quiet hilltop about an hour north of Edmonton, Alberta. Mid-January 2009, it is the beginning of the end of a long criminal investigation.
There are new details tonight about the murders of 4 Mounties in Mayerthorpe.
2 brothers-in-law pleaded guilty to manslaughter.
Hennessy gave Roscoe a rifle and a box of ammunition. Hennessy and Cheeseman drove Roscoe.
One of those young men is Sean Hennessy, 29. The other accused is his wife's 25-year-old brother, Dennis Cheeseman. For the RCMP, justice is at hand, but still a troubling question resurfaces.
What do you say to those who say that these 2 men are scapegoats?
These 2 men came forward and pled guilty. There is no scapegoat aspect to this whatsoever.
That's the official line. 2 men came forward and pled guilty. Good evening and welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Lyndon McIntyre, and as you'll hear tonight from one of those 2 men, the full story isn't quite that simple. The accused felt they were under extraordinary pressure from the police, prosecutors and their own lawyers, and facing a family financial crisis when they agreed to cut their losses and to accept a legal compromise that they might regret for the rest of their lives. For Sean Hennessy, the prospect of imprisonment is only slightly more depressing than a question he can never answer. What if? What if, on March 2nd, 2005, he'd taken steps to stop a man who would 12 hours later become a murderer? Ever crossed your mind to tackle him on the doorstep there?
Absolutely. You know, we sit here today and my regret is not doing that. Wrestling him to the ground and taking the gun from him and doing what I had to do. Shooting him.
The man who killed the Mounties was a convicted sexual predator who was known to have used guns to get his way. His name was James Roscoe, and he lived alone on a hilltop farm at Rochefort Bridge near Mayerthorpe, Alberta.
He was a quiet, lonely guy. He was by himself. Every time I seen him, he was very quiet.
He had a reputation around Mayerthorpe in particular, as a bully, a pervert, a pretty rough character. Did you see any of that stuff?
I never personally seen any of that stuff, absolutely not.
Sean lived in Barrhead, but in Mayerthorpe, an hour away, nearly everybody knew about James Roscoe's violent past, which included frequent run-ins with the Mounties. The last chapter in a long history of trouble with the law started on the afternoon of March 2nd, 2005. Bailiffs arrived at Roscoe's farm to repossess a white pickup truck. They got a hostile reception. They asked the RCMP for help. But Roscoe and the truck took off before the Mounties got there. Within minutes, the police arrived. With the farm abandoned, the bailiffs and the Mounties went exploring. What they found would set the scene for a disaster. Roscoe was growing pot. He had several hundred plants in a barn. After he fled the bailiffs in the truck, Roscoe contacted a young acquaintance in Barrhead with a troubling request.
I was at work. I was running a service truck for Cal Tire, and I received a phone call from James Roscoe telling me that bailiffs were at his house and they were trying to seize a pickup truck that he wasn't making payments on. He was wanting to leave his pickup truck at my house.
What did you tell him?
I told him I'd prefer if he didn't.
Why do you think he picked you?
He knew that my property is off the highway. He knew that it's not visible from, you know, for anybody to just drive by and see what's going on.
Hennessy would have been the last person in Barrhead you'd have expected to get involved with Jim Roscoe. Clean-cut, former amateur boxer, married to Christine. They have 2 little girls. He was a manager here, a local shop for fixing cars and trucks and farm machinery, a place frequented by James Roscoe.
First thing that I've ever had anything to do with him outside the tire shop was an old Camaro he had at his house that he wanted a stereo system installed in.
Later there was another request, one that would have long-term consequences that Hennessy couldn't have imagined. Roscoe wanted to borrow a high-powered rifle that belonged to Hennessy's grandfather.
He told me he had a bear at his house. I had shot a bear with that rifle years ago, hunting with my grandfather. And had come up in conversation, you know, with him being at the tire shop or wherever, and he knew I had it, and he wanted it. I loaned him the gun, and he brought it back.
Sean's brother-in-law, Dennis Cheeseman, who lived with them, was also an unlikely friend of Jim Roscoe. He was shy, kept to himself, spent a lot of time with Christine, Sean, and their 2 little girls.
Roscoe was planting trees at his farm, and Dennis hanging out at the tire shop, and Roscoe showed up and got to know Dennis as my brother-in-law, and asked him, you know, if he would come along and help dig holes in his property to plant trees in.
In time, Sean's casual work-related relationship with Roscoe took a dangerous turn.
Did you know what was going on inside of the Quonset?
I knew that he was growing marijuana. On numerous occasions I had acquired marijuana from James Roscoe and sold it for him.
You did that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's something that the public eye is not going to look too kindly at. I mean, it's an illegal act.
Yeah.
And I was in the middle of it.
But the marijuana was a factor that clearly gave Roscoe a sense of control over Hennessy. He ignored Hennessy's initial refusal to help him hide his truck from the bailiffs on March 2nd, 2005, and he was soon on Hennessy's doorstep.
He had shown up at my house, and I was on the phone with Sean, and he was saying like that this guy was going to come and bring, I'd only met him once, so I don't really know him. He was saying that this guy was going to come and ask if he could leave his truck at the house. And he said, tell him no. And he pulled in. And so I just told Sean, like, well, you know what? You talk to him. He's here. So I handed him the phone. And I turned my back. And I went into the our bedroom. And I was helping the girls clean up their mess.
Hennessy says he once again reiterated that he couldn't help Roscoe hide the truck. And he thought that was the end of the matter. He was wrong.
I had come home from work, and he was still in the yard. And we talked for a minute. He told me that that was fine, and you know, he was going to find another place to leave his truck. He left.
I get the impression that at a certain point during the evening, things got a little bit more scary as far as he was concerned.
Yeah, numerous hours later, he came back with the truck.
This is after you told him a couple of times you didn't want that truck at your place. He comes back again.
When he come back the second time, you know, I seen the vehicle pull in the driveway, and I went to the door. By the time I had got to the door, Jim was there with a 9mm Beretta in his hand.
A gun. After being told a couple of times to buzz off, politely, I'm sure, he's there with a gun in his hand.
Absolutely.
How did you react?
I didn't know what to do. I was, you know, it was defense for my family at that time. You know, he wanted a ride home, and he was going to get it.
But a ride wasn't all he wanted.
He was quite agitated, and he demanded the rifle. He wanted it again.
And he already had a pistol in his hand.
Absolutely.
So what did you do?
I never had an option. I went and I went and got the gun for him.
So how did it unfold after that?
I give him the rifle. I did what I could to keep him out of the house. That's where my family was at, and that's not where I wanted him. He told me that he wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to leave the truck at my house, but he needed a ride. I had to give him a ride. So he's outside, and now he has my grandfather's rifle as well. And Dennis pulls in.
Your brother-in-law.
My brother-in-law. Right away he knows something's wrong. I'm white as a ghost and terrified. So Jim sees him coming and says, let's go. And when Dennis got out of the car, I asked him to come along for a ride.
Roscoe had arranged to hide the pickup truck at his aunt's house, about 50 kilometers away near the community of Cheer Hill. The boys followed him there in Sean's car.
We waited at the end of the driveway for him to come back, and when he came back, he asked Dennis to get in the back seat, and he jumped in the front and gave me directions to drive to his house.
And he still had the weapons?
He had both of them at that time.
Did he offer any explanation about what was going on?
He told me that his plan was to go home and get rid of the marijuana grow-up that he had concealed in a Quonset hut. And the reason behind the rifle was 2 fuel tanks just outside the back of the Quonset hut that he was going to puncture with the rifle.
And what, set a fire or something?
And set a fire and burn what was inside his Quonset hut, which was the marijuana grow operation.
Now, did he or you guys know, I mean, that the place was, that there were Mounties there at the time?
I knew that there was bailiffs there earlier in the day when he had phoned me, but I had no idea that there was Mounties at his place.
Because there's been a lot of talk about him ranting about Mounties all over his property, and he's going to murder them all, and you were supposed to, I mean, in you know, hindsight, you were supposed to have done something about that. What did he say about Mounties?
There was no talk of Mounties ever from James Roscoe to myself. Never. He wanted to go home and
burn his
dope.
Roscoe told Hennessy to drop him off near his mother's house, which was about a kilometer through a field and down the hill from his place, but with a direct view of his property.
He got out. He took the rifle with him and stuffed his handgun back into his pants, and off he went. I never looked back.
Could you see police cars up there? Could you see police activity from where you were?
I could see a single set of headlights on his property, and I could see lights that were on inside his mobile home that was on the property. But there was no red and blue flashing lights. It seemed fairly calm. There wasn't much activity there.
When we come back, bloodshed.
It was devastating that people lost their lives for what? For marijuana?
By late evening, March 2nd, 2005, James Roscoe's barn had become a crime scene. Police officers from Mayerthorpe and other detachments were clearing out hundreds of marijuana plants and a collection of stolen vehicles and parts. By 4:30 a.m. on March 3rd, 2005, most of the Mounties had left the scene. 2 officers were told to guard the place. They were Anthony Gordon and Leo Johnston. By early morning, Roscoe was lurking not far away, armed with a pistol and the rifle Hennessy had given him. He'd been sitting among the weeds for most of the night, watching. About 9:30 that morning, Constable Peter Sheeman and Constable Brock Myrall, who'd only been a Mountie for about 2 weeks, showed up at Roscoe's farm. Roscoe would seize a moment of distraction and sneak into his barn. The pot plants were gone, but somewhere he recovered an illegal weapon he'd owned for several years, a Heckler Koch assault rifle. Minutes later, 2 more officers arrived from Edmonton, Constable Stephen Vigor and Constable Garrett Hoogstraat. The 2 newcomers would later report seeing the 4 Mounties who were already there walking towards the front of the Quonset hut, then hearing gunfire. When the firing stopped, 4 officers were either dead or mortally wounded. Roscoe left the Quonset hut. Constable Stephen Vigor, who had just arrived, spotted him, fired his weapon, struck Roscoe twice. Roscoe then retreated into the Quonset, shot through the left hand. His thigh bone shattered. He later killed himself. Roscoe was found in the barn, the Beretta pistol tucked into his waistband. The assault rifle lay between his legs. The Hennessy rifle was at his right side. It had not been fired.
When did you first realize that things had gone completely haywire up at Jim Roscoe's place?
I got up the next morning and I had a manager's meeting in the city that I had to attend. The radio was broken in my car, so I had nothing but CDs to listen to, and when I got home, Christine told me what had taken place at James Roscoe's house.
I can imagine how that hit you.
I was devastated that you know, I may have been the last person that he had any contact with before all of this had taken place.
When did you first hear about this thing?
It was like around lunchtime, and I had turned on the radio while I was doing dishes, and I heard something about 4 RCMP officers taken, I don't know if this is the word, but taken hostage. They weren't responding. They were inside the Quonset, and then I heard the name, Jim Roscoe, and I was like, oh my God, this guy was at my house. So yeah, you flash back, and it's like, oh my God, like, how could you not see this happening, right? It was hours later, they'd sent in a robot, and that 4 officers were gunned down. And I just cried. It was sad. It was devastating that people lost their lives for what? For marijuana?
For Sean, it was a nightmare come true, and the gravity of the situation soon settled on them like a shroud.
I gave this guy a ride home. I gave him a rifle.
Did it occur to you that maybe that was the rifle he'd used?
I thought that maybe it could have been.
Your granddad's rifle?
Yeah, I thought maybe it could have been. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified.
And then all they played on the radio was, how did he get home? That was the big question, right? So right away, we're thinking they're looking to blame somebody. We were scared.
Did you feel that they were looking to blame you guys?
Well, that was the big question, right? How did he get home? And that is how he got home. So, yeah.
It was a critical moment. The countryside stunned by the killings. A time for rational reflection. But for the Hennessy's, it was a time of paralyzing fear.
I guess where people will ask the question, and I'm sure you've been asked it before, why wouldn't you have stepped up and said, I can help, up to a point?
I was totally in a different state of mind. I was absolutely terrified of the involvement I had, and I didn't know what was going to, I didn't know what was going to come out of it. I thought I had to just lay low.
Just hope it went away?
Hopefully.
It was a hope that, in retrospect, was pathetically naive.
How long before you get the sense, I'm sitting in the middle of a big bullseye, and they're going to come?
It wasn't long. I I knew how he had gotten home. This was a question that they wanted answered. And I was terrified to admit that.
Did you feel responsible?
To an extent, I couldn't help but to feel responsible. I was how this lunatic had gotten home. But at the same time, I only did it in fear of my family.
It didn't take long for the police to trace the registered rifle back to Hennessy's grandfather and to link Roscoe to Sean.
I was questioned numerous, 2 or 3 times by the RCMP and wasn't honest with them. I didn't want to be affiliated with James Roscoe. And I did what I thought I had to do to pull myself out of the predicament. So I lied.
So let's go back to the beginning with what you know today. What would have happened? Say you had the gift of seeing the future.
It would have been a terrible situation at my doorstep. But who knows what the outcome could have been.
Maybe he wrestled the gun away from him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe a family dies that night instead. That's just it. You don't know. So scary thoughts.
When we come back, a reckoning.
They have my wife. Face down in the driveway.
After months of intense police activity following the murders on Roscoe's farm, life in Bar Head seemed to settle down again. Then a stranger came to town. He was a welder who didn't seem to do much welding. He seemed more interested in making friends, and he was going out of his way to form a friendship with Sean Hennessy. For legal reasons, we can't name him, but he had a snowmobile, a truck, and few obvious responsibilities. He seemed always game for recreation. Then his girlfriend showed up, moved into this house with him. The newcomer socialized a bit with Hennessy and his wife Christine, but from the outset, something about them didn't seem to add up.
It was in the back of my mind that he was a police officer, absolutely.
But you weren't a friend, but you were friendly.
Yes.
Why didn't you just tell them to buzz off?
I didn't feel the need to. They wanted to, I wouldn't allow them to get very close, as a friend, because I knew, I had a feeling it was a betrayal.
In retrospect, 2006 was a banner year for strangers in Bar Head, Alberta. A storybook encounter outside the plant where Dennis Cheeseman worked. A lady in distress. Some kind of car trouble. Cheeseman helped her, and to his surprise, she seemed to be attracted to him. Sure enough, romance seemed to be developing between Dennis and the pretty stranger, who also must be nameless.
He's very naive. He's not a very social person, and when this so-called girlfriend, this girl showed up in front of Sapalo late at night, he was
Taken in.
Smitten.
Yes.
They don't jump out at him every day saying,
exactly, yes.
Head over heels. He was, that's all he talked about. Never seen him hardly anymore after that. He was constantly in the city with his girlfriend, and he thought he had it made now.
And then she had broken contact with him, and that's when the friends were introduced.
Dennis started spending more time in the city, and soon the girlfriend's gang of friends were cutting Dennis into shady deals. If you haven't yet figured out that they were undercover cops, well, that's all right. Dennis Cheeseman was completely taken in by them. For the girlfriend's sake, he was even prepared to go along with things he probably considered to be illegal. He even made up stories to make himself seem to be just as bad as he thought they were. Then in early July 2007, the games ended abruptly. Dennis Cheeseman was arrested by his new friends and charged with capital murder. At a certain point, Dennis gave what has been called a confession. What did you think at that point?
I was lost for words. I was sick to my stomach. Why would he admit guilt where there's no guilt due?
What did you think he had confessed to?
To the drive home, you know, to the rifle. You know, to being associated with Roscoe. I had no idea that he would ever admit to something that is not true.
Wait, what do you mean? You did drive him home?
Absolutely.
You did give him the rifle?
Yes.
You did know him?
Yes.
So where was what Dennis admitted not true?
He told police in coerced statements through a Mr. Big Sting that he was involved, that James Roscoe told him what he was going to do. He told him he was going to kill police officers.
And you were there?
I was there. There was no such words exchanged. I mean, he was on a mission to burn down that Quonset hut.
And where did Dennis get the notion then that Jim Roscoe was going to go up there and blow away a bunch of policemen?
He thought that he had been doing things for the mob, and he had told me that he honestly can't even explain, just that he was scared, and he just said what they wanted to hear. They don't realize that he said it out of fear.
Are you guys mad at Dennis?
No.
For falling for this?
No, we love Dennis, and I put myself in his shoes, and, you know, maybe I wouldn't have done exactly the same thing, but I see why he did.
Sean?
I understand.
There's no hate towards Dennis. He's a young, naive individual who got himself caught up into something that he couldn't control.
Saturday, July 7th, 2007, in Barrhead, Sean Hennessy and his wife received the shocking but not entirely unexpected news: Dennis was in jail. Sunday morning, July 8th, Sean and Christine were at a cousin's house to tell her about Dennis.
I had a feeling that it was coming. We had a phone call from Dennis's lawyer, and we had known that he was taken into custody.
Sean had left his office cell phone in the car. He needed it, so he went out to get it. He saw a stranger on the sidewalk.
He was standing there with the cell phone in his hand and claiming that it wouldn't work in town. His vehicle had broken down, and he was requesting the use of my cell phone, which I denied. As soon as I turned my back, he tackled me. They come from everywhere. There was police everywhere, absolutely everywhere you look. Here I lay on the ground looking up the rifle, up the barrel of 20 different rifles. They're pinning me down like I'm a 7-foot giant that's trying to resist. I laid there in shock, with them standing on my legs and my hands and my neck and my head and everywhere.
And I went running out the house, and there was 3 steps to get down, and I was about to jump them, and this guy with his face painted black and green, he was in black and green all over, and I don't know what kind of gun it was. I mean, it was huge. It was like this big, and it was pointed at my head, and he just started screaming, "Get down, get down." So I got down, and I had my hands like this, and I didn't even want to look up because I was so scared.
This is taking place. I'm looking around, and they have my wife. Face down in the driveway. Dragging her through the dirt.
I looked up and I saw Sean being put into a cop car. And I just said, I love you. I just mouthed it, just so he knew.
When we come back, the burden of remorse.
My regret is not doing that. Wrestling him to the ground and taking the gun from him and doing what I had to do. Shooting him.
There is little here today to mark this peaceful hilltop farm as one of the most notorious crime scenes in Canadian history. But in March 2005, for James Roscoe, this was a sanctuary and a fortress. On the night of March the 2nd, the place was overrun by people Roscoe thought he was at war with, the police. From the beginning, it was hard to believe that one man could have murdered 4 trained policemen without help. It took 2 years to build a circumstantial case that the help he got the night before the shootout from Hennessy and Cheeseman made them just as guilty as he was. And in July of 2007, Hennessy and Cheeseman were each charged with 4 counts of capital murder. The gist of the prosecution case is this, that knowing Roscoe, they should also have known what he was capable of doing. But if they should have known, shouldn't senior Mounties also have known of Roscoe's violent streak? And yet it seems they didn't. For 15 hours before the tragedy, the focus of police attention was not on Roscoe, but on his barn. 2 lightly armed officers were left standing guard over the barn, even after it had been substantially emptied of evidence. One of the 4 officers, when attacked, didn't have a weapon. The Crown case, even with a half-baked confession from Dennis Cheeseman, wasn't likely to add up to murder without more concrete admissions from the accused.
They play good cop, bad cop. They show you pictures. They show you videos of footage of the fallen Force family, and they just try to tear you apart.
What were you telling them?
In the advice of my lawyer, I wish to say nothing, and please put me back in my cell. Over and over.
Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to be honest. I wanted to come clean and just tell them exactly how things came about, and take responsibility for the actions that I had done.
Giving him a drive, loaning him a rifle,
That's right.
dropping him off. Those were the 3 things you did.
Those are the 3. Well, I sold a bit of marijuana for him.
They say you also had knowledge that he was going to go up the hill and go after Mounties and harm them as much as he could. What's the truth?
There's no way that he had knowledge of what he was going to do, let alone, you know, me who drove him home. I mean, he told me what he was going to do. I believed him. I didn't really care.
And he told you he was going to do what?
He told me he was going to shoot these gas tanks and burn down that Quonset hut.
And the dope that was inside.
And the dope that was inside. I didn't think anything beyond that.
Let me be the bad cop for a second. You knowingly gave Jimmy Roscoe a drive back to near his place with a weapon, knowing that he was going to go up there and shoot 4 police officers dead.
That's absolutely couldn't be more wrong. That was not his intentions, and I mean, I meant for no harm to come to anybody. I just wanted to do what he told me to do, because he he was threatening. He was, you know, he had a loaded 9mm pistol in his hand. And I thought, had I not done what he told me to do, you know, that he would come back at any point in time. And chances are he would come back when I was away at work with my wife and children at home.
The police officers would, and I'm sure they've said that, why didn't you call them and ask them for help? A, warn them, and B, ask them for help dealing with this crazy man.
I don't know, I wanted it to go away. I didn't, you know, had I phoned the police, who's to say he wouldn't have come back?
He'd been in jail before, right? He had been arrested, he'd been in there, and he got out. And he was able to terrorize again. So who's to say he's not going to go to jail again for that? For threatening us? Because that's what we would have called for, right? We didn't know anything else that was going on, so we would have called and said that he threatened us. What good is that going to do us when he's just going to get out? Where does that put us? It does nothing. Nothing for us.
Ever cross your mind to tackle him on the doorstep there?
Absolutely. You know, we sit here today, and my regret is not doing that. Wrestling him to the ground and taking the gun from him and doing what I had to do. Shooting him.
If you had to do it again.
It's the way it would happen.
Hennessy wasn't the only one to underestimate Jim Roscoe in March of 2005. An internal police report claims that Roscoe, while well known to the police for his criminal record and his numerous physical confrontations, was not considered a deadly threat to officers. The report concludes the murders were premeditated, but were also unprecedented and unanticipated. Approaching the 4th anniversary of the tragedy here, the prosecution abruptly reversed direction, offered to reduce the murder charges to manslaughter if Hennessy and Cheeseman would agree to plead guilty. With their financial resources depleted and facing the prospect of a long trial and fearing a guilty verdict that could fetch multiple life sentences, they took the prosecution offer.
That's right.
We spoke to Sean and Christine Hennessy on the evening before Sean and Christine's brother, Dennis Cheeseman, walked into an Edmonton court to plead guilty to 4 counts each of manslaughter.
But you are going to plead guilty. Why?
That's a difficult question to answer. I'm trying to move on with my life. You know, with the least impact as possible. And I believe that this is the way to go. And put this behind me and move on with life and be at home with my family. They mean the world to me. I just I can't risk looking at a life sentence. I don't know. I have no faith in the justice system.
And how is your brother coping? He doesn't have the wife.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the, you know, the parents and the support system that Sean has.
He's not really coping.
Do you worry about his ability to get through this?
Yep. He even told the police that it's not worth living for. Those were his exact words. So yeah, I am worried.
The emphasis has in many ways understandably been placed on 4 dead police officers and their families. And but Jim Roscoe left a lot more wreckage, didn't he?
He did. He ruined so many lives. Ours can be repaired, and unfortunately, the lives of those that he took can't. And we grieve for them, because, you know, we can imagine what it'd be like to get our family taken away. And so in some degree, we're there with them. We understand. We feel their sorrow. I just hope that one day they can feel ours.
But you and Dennis do feel responsibility in a way.
I feel partially guilty. That's why we've decided to go in on Monday and enter a plea. Guilty.
The next morning in a courtroom in Edmonton, they entered guilty pleas. On Friday last week, an Alberta judge sentenced Sean Hennessy to 15 years and Dennis Cheeseman to 12 years in penitentiary for their unwitting role in the murder of 4 police officers by James Roscoe, March 3rd, 2005.